The village of St. Giles had always been a quiet corner of England, nestled in rolling countryside, where gossip spread faster than the wind, and nothing darker than a petty squabble disturbed the peace. Yet on that spring evening, when the glass house, lights of Sir Alister Crane's famed botanical gardens, burned late into the night, something altogether more sinister crept into the village. It was only when the gardener arrived at dawn that the alarm was raised, and within an hour, half the parish seemed to be gathered at the wrought-iron gates, staring toward the shimmering panes of the great glass conservatory where the crime had taken place. Inside, the sight was chilling. Sir Alister himself, a man of robust health despite his 60 years, lay slumped in a wicker chair amid a riot of orchids, exotic ferns, and rare blooms that had been his life's obsession. His eyes were wide, staring glassily at the ceiling above, and in his hand he clutched a broken shard of glass. There was no blood, no apparent wound, and no signs of forced entry. The glass house doors had been locked from the inside, their keys still hanging from Sir Alister's own waistcoat pocket. It seemed impossible that anyone else could have entered, and yet no one who looked at the scene could believe he had died by chance. The most peculiar clue of all lay beside him, a small patch of soil scattered across the tiled floor, upon which sat a single crushed flower. It was a snowdrop, delicate and pale, but this was late spring, weeks past the flower's natural season, and far removed from the tropical plants Sir Alister had prided himself on cultivating. The snowdrop appeared completely out of place, as though dropped there deliberately, a cruel marker left behind. The local constable, young Inspector Davis, was entirely flummoxed. He spoke too quickly, paced too much, and tried to impress the gathered villagers with his theories. But even he seemed to falter beneath their doubtful stares. A heart attack, he first suggested, though why the man would be found clutching a shard of glass seemed beyond explanation. Suicide, then. Yet Sir Alister had been in high spirits only the day before, boasting of a new orchid species he hoped to unveil at the upcoming county fair. None of it fitted neatly, and as the hours dragged on, confusion thickened like the mist on the moors. It was Miss Marple who first stepped quietly into the garden, her presence hardly noticed until she spoke. She had been invited by Lady Crane, the widow, who was pale with shock, but insisted that the old friend who had an eye for things others miss should come. Miss Marple's soft steps carried her across the conservatory floor, and she paused to examine the odd scattering of soil, the snowdrop, the broken glass in Sir Alister's hand. She said little, only nodding once or twice, her keen blue eyes absorbing every detail. "What strikes me most," she finally murmured, more to herself than anyone else, "is not what is here, but what is absent. In a garden so meticulously ordered, an intruder is a louder presence than they may think." The words unsettled those listening, for they hinted at intrusion where none seemed possible. How could anyone have come or gone with the doors locked and no broken panes in sight? And yet the implication was clear. Someone had been inside unseen and had left behind a calling card in the form of a single, untimely snowdrop. The villagers who had gathered outside in growing numbers whispered theories. Some swore it must have been poison, slipped into Sir Alister's evening tea. Others claimed it was the work of rivals jealous of his botanical triumphs. A few muttered darker tales of old feuds and hidden family disputes, for Sir Alister was not universally beloved. His arrogance had made more than a few enemies in his time. Miss Marple, however, asked a quieter question. She inquired who had keys to the conservatory, and Lady Crane answered reluctantly that only Sir Alister himself, the head gardener, and their household butler possessed them. Yet the gardener was accounted for, having arrived only at dawn, and the butler had been at his post throughout the night. That narrowed the field, yet also deepened the puzzle. If no one had entered, how had death come? The inspector grew flustered as Miss Marple requested to see Sir Alister's ledger of plants, the small leather-bound book he always carried to note his specimens. Curiously, it was missing. A thorough search revealed no sign of it, though. The old man never parted with it. That discovery brought a hush to the room, for it suggested theft, and theft required an intruder. The evening stretched long, the conservatory glimmering in the lamplight, while the village waited for answers. Rumours swirled, yet Miss Marple sat calmly, her knitting folded neatly in her lap as she observed each nervous statement, each contradictory detail. The missing ledger, the out-of-season snowdrop, the locked doors, the shard of glass. Pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. But she had seen such puzzles before, and she knew that the smallest detail, dismissed as trivial, often proved to be the thread that unraveled the whole. As the constable finally led the villagers away and the ylist house sank into uneasy silence, Miss Marple lingered in the glass house. She bent once more to the patch of soil and touched it lightly with her fingertip, noting its dampness. Not the soil from any of Sir Alistair's plants, but darker, heavier, the kind she recognized from churchyards rather than conservatories. Her eyes lifted to the snowdrop again, and in that moment she felt a cold certainty. This was no accident, no sudden seizure of the heart. Someone had been here, someone with both knowledge of flowers and knowledge of Sir Alistair himself, and they had chosen their clue with purpose. The mystery of the glass garden had only just begun, but already Miss Marple knew one thing beyond doubt. The snowdrop was not a mistake. It was a message, and it was meant to be read. Inspector Davis spent the better part of the morning shuffling in and out of the glass house, his face flushed with the effort of trying to look authoritative, while villagers whispered about his inexperience. He had sealed off the conservatory, ordered statements from the servants, and even sent a constable to fetch the local physician to confirm the obvious fact that Sir Alistair was dead. Yet, for all his bustle, very little progress had been made. Every word he spoke seemed to circle back to the same conclusions. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, and no apparent cause of death. Miss Marple sat quietly on a garden bench just outside the conservatory, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag, watching. She never hurried, she never appeared restless. Instead, she let the scene unfold, noting the way people moved, the timbre of their voices, the expressions they tried to suppress when they thought no one was watching. Such things told her more than Inspector Davis's endless questioning. Lady Crane, for instance, was remarkably composed for a widow. Her pale face betrayed some sorrow, yes, but her gaze wandered often to the gathered villagers, as if calculating the impression she made upon them. When the physician finally emerged to declare Sir Alistair's death likely due to heart failure, Lady Crane let slip a sigh of relief that seemed oddly disproportionate, as though she had been bracing for an altogether different announcement. Inside the conservatory, Miss Marple requested a private moment. Inspector Davis, though reluctant, acquiesced, largely because he knew she was well regarded by the community, and Lady Crane herself had vouched for her. Alone among the tropical plants, Miss Marple let her eyes sweep over the setting again. The faint sheen of condensation on the glass, the overturned watering can in the corner, the soil where the snowdrop had been found. It struck her now that the soil was not merely out of place, but deliberately scattered, as though someone had wished it noticed. And yet, why leave so conspicuous a mark unless it was intended as misdirection? Her gaze drifted to the wicker chair. Sir Alistair had been seated upright, but one of the chair legs bore a fine scratch as though it had been dragged slightly before settling. Near the chair leg lay a tiny sliver of glass, distinct from the shard clutched in the dead man's hand. She bent closer. It was thinner, sharper, and bore a faint, greenish tint that did not match the clear panes of the conservatory windows. This fragment was from somewhere else, perhaps a bottle, not the glass house at all. She did not call attention to it immediately. Instead, she pocketed the shard discreetly in her handkerchief, knowing that the constable would likely dismiss it as irrelevant. To Miss Marple, however, irrelevance was often the very heart of a case. The household was summoned for further questioning. The butler, an elderly man named Fenton, stood stiffly by the door, his answers clipped, his hands trembling slightly when he mentioned the missing ledger. He claimed to know nothing of its whereabouts, yet his eyes darted toward Lady Crane before he spoke, as though gauging her reaction. The gardener, Mr. Hales, protested his innocence loudly, offended at being suspected, insisting he had only just arrived at dawn. His boots, however, carried no traces of mud despite the heavy dew outside, which Miss Marple noted silently. And then there was Lydia, the young maid who fidgeted constantly and avoided everyone's eyes. twisting her apron strings as if they might unravel the truth from her hands. Miss Marple observed all this without interruption. She asked only a single question of Lydia, her tone kindly, almost grandmotherly. "My dear, were you in the conservatory at all yesterday?" The maid hesitated just a fraction of a second too long before answering no. It was a small thing. But small things were Miss Marple's bread and butter. Inspector Davis, meanwhile, pursued more dramatic theories. He had already suggested to the widow that Sir Alistair might have fallen victim to a rare tropical plant's toxic pollen, an idea plucked, no doubt, from some half-remembered adventure novel rather than scientific evidence. Miss Marple almost smiled at the notion, but she said nothing. Instead, she leaned on her walking stick and watched as Lady Crane stiffened at the mention of poison, though she quickly masked the reaction. The missing ledger returned to her mind. Why would anyone take a notebook of plant records unless it contained something more? Perhaps it hid a financial irregularity, a coded message, or a clue to dealings outside Sir Alistair's beloved garden. Whatever the reason, it was not the kind of object a common thief would value. By afternoon, the villagers had dispersed, but the household remained under a cloud of suspicion. Miss Marple asked quietly if she might have tea with Lady Crane, who, though reluctant, agreed. In the drawing-room, Miss Marple's gentle questions seemed innocuous enough. How long had the Cranes been married? What sort of man was Sir Alistair? What friends did he keep? Lady Crane spoke in practiced tones, portraying her husband as brilliant but difficult, admired yet arrogant. She mentioned his many admirers in the botanical world with a curl of disdain, though she pretended to mean nothing by it. Miss Marple listened, knitting in hand, her needles clicking softly as she watched the widow's face. It was when she asked quite casually if Sir Alistair had ever received snowdrops as a gift that Lady Crane faltered. Just for a moment her lips parted, her eyes widened, and she fumbled with her teacup. It was swiftly covered, of course, with a laugh and a denial, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught the slip. The snowdrop was no random clue. It had meaning to someone in this house. The day drew to a close with little official progress. Inspector Davis, frustrated, muttered about summoning assistance from Scotland Yard. Miss Marple did not discourage him, but she knew that by the time the yard arrived, the trail would be colder and the lies more carefully rehearsed. What mattered now were the fresh impressions, the nervous tremor in Fenton's hand, the maid's guilty hesitation, the widow's slip at the mention of snowdrops, and the shard of green glass now resting in her handkerchief. Later that evening, as she walked slowly back to her cottage, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to settle into their familiar patterns. A locked room, a missing ledger, a snowdrop in spring, a glass shard not of the conservatory's making, and reactions that spoke louder than words. Deception was already woven through the household, though the threads had not yet revealed their pattern. But she could feel the shape of it forming, like a tapestry glimpsed from the wrong side. Somewhere in the glass garden lay the truth of Sir Alistair's death, hidden not by its complexity, but by the simplicity of human deceit. And Miss Marple, with her keen eye and sharper patience, intended to find it. The next morning dawned bright and cool, sunlight spilling across the lawns of the Crane estate, glinting off the conservatory panes as though mocking the darkness within. Inspector Davis returned with renewed determination, his boots striking sharply on the gravel, but his expression betrayed the uncertainty of a man who had slept poorly and dreamed worse. He gathered the household into the drawing-room for formal questioning, determined to impose order where confusion still reigned. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in a corner chair, her knitting in her lap, needles clicking softly as though she were simply passing the time. Yet every flicker of an eye, every tremor of a voice, was registered with absolute precision. The first to be questioned was Fenton, the butler. Tall, stooped and meticulous in dress, he answered each query with measured precision, his voice calm but dry. He explained that he had last seen Sir Alistair after dinner the previous evening, when he had carried a tray of brandy to the library. Sir Alistair, he said, had dismissed him curtly and later retired to the conservatory, as he often did when restless. Asked if he had entered the glass-house that night, Fenton denied it flatly. The master valued his solitude, he said. I never intruded. Miss Marple noted, however, that his hands clasped tightly behind his back trembled slightly, as he spoke. When Inspector Davis asked if he had noticed the missing ledger, Fenton replied too quickly, "I wouldn't know anything about that, sir." Too quick, Miss Marple thought, for someone who had spent decades cataloguing every detail of the household. His words seemed rehearsed, as though he had prepared them in advance. Next came Lydia, the maid. She was pale, her apron wrinkled from nervous hands. She admitted that she had seen Sir Alistair enter the conservatory around 10 o'clock, carrying his ledger under his arm. But then she hesitated, her lips trembling, before she added, I thought I heard voices later, near midnight. I couldn't be sure, though. Perhaps it was just the wind in the glass." Her eyes darted nervously to Lady Crane, who sat stiffly with folded hands, and Miss Marple caught the silent exchange. The girl knew more than she dared say, but fear, of whom, held her tongue. The gardener, Mr. Hales, followed, his broad frame filling the doorway as he blustered into the room. He was offended by the implication that he might have harmed his employer. "I tended his orchids like they were my own children," he declared. He swore he had been at home with his wife all night, though no one present could verify the claim. "As for that snowdrop," he added, "I know nothing of it, not my doing that, and I'd thank you not to suggest otherwise." Yet the defensiveness of his tone made the denial less convincing than silence might have. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she considered that point. A guilty man might deny with outrage, but an innocent one often denied with hurt. Confusion. Finally Lady Crane herself spoke, her voice steady, though her eyes glittered faintly with something unspoken. She insisted she had retired early and heard nothing until the morning. She described her husband's habits as eccentric, but harmless, dismissing the notion that anyone in the house could wish him ill. Yet, when Inspector Davis asked if Sir Alistair had enemies in the botanical community, she allowed a faint smile. "My husband prided himself on his brilliance. Pride, Inspector, does not win friends." The words carried a sharp edge, almost a relish, as though she savoured the memory of his arrogance. Throughout these exchanges, contradictions emerged like hairline cracks in glass. Fenton swore Sir Alistair had not been disturbed, yet Lydia heard voices. Lydia claimed to have seen the ledger in his hand, but when the conservatory was searched, it was gone. Mr. Hales denied knowledge of the snowdrop, though the soil in which it had been planted suggested a gardener's touch. And Lady Crane spoke of her husband's solitude, yet betrayed familiarity with his rivalries that seemed almost too intimate for a woman who professed indifference to his work. Inspector Davis scribbled furiously in his notebook, his brow furrowed, but Miss Marple was more interested in the silences between words. When Lydia described the voices, Fenton's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. When the snowdrop was mentioned, Lady Crane's fingers twitched. Against the arm of her chair, a tiny tremor quickly stilled. And when the ledger was discussed, Mr. Hales shifted uneasily in his seat, as though reminded of something best forgotten. Miss Marple asked only one question during the proceedings, in her soft, almost apologetic voice. "Forgive me," she said to Lady Crane, "but did Sir Alistair ever gift you snowdrops? They are such a gentle flower, symbolizing remembrance and consolation." Lady Crane's head snapped toward her, eyes wide for a fraction of a second before she composed herself. "No," she said evenly. "Never. Sir Alistair was not a man of flowers. His affections lay with his specimens, not with his wife." The bitterness in her tone was unmistakable. After the questioning concluded, Inspector Davis declared the matter still inconclusive and retreated to his study of reports. The household dispersed, each to their duties or their pretense of them, leaving Miss Marple once more to her thoughts. She rose, stretched her stiff legs, and wandered into the garden, where the sun filtered through the leaves in dapples of gold. She reflected on what she had heard, not so much the words themselves, but the patterns they formed. Everyone had spoken, yet none had told the whole truth. Each version of events overlapped just enough to appear credible, but left behind ragged edges that did not align. What struck her most was the eagerness with which some had spoken. Mr. Hales had protested too loudly, eager to distance himself from the snowdrop. Lady Crane had spoken with too much composure, too much control. Only Lydia, with her faltering words and frightened glances, seemed genuinely conflicted, torn between loyalty and fear. Miss Marple resolved to speak with her again, gently and alone. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned briefly to the conservatory. The damp soil where the snowdrop had been found had dried slightly, leaving a faint outline on the tile. She traced it with her finger, her mind working over the contradictions, like a seamstress untangling a knot of thread. The shard of green glass still rested in her handbag, its significance yet uncertain, but she felt its weight pressing against the mystery. Somewhere among the conflicting voices of deception lay the truth, buried beneath fear, pride, and resentment. And Miss Marple, with her patient eye and unerring sense of human nature, intended to draw it forth. The Crane estate seemed strangely subdued the following day, as if the ivy-clad house itself held its breath beneath the weight of suspicion. The staff moved about their duties in silence, the clink of teacups and the shuffle of footsteps amplified by the absence of Sir Alistair's booming presence. Yet beneath that hush, Miss Marple could feel the restless thrum of unease. Each member of the household carried secrets, and secrets rarely stayed buried when death had forced them into the light. Inspector Davis remained flustered, his notes littered with contradictory statements. He paced about, muttering about the missing ledger and the mysterious snowdrop, but his efforts lacked focus. Miss Marple, by contrast, preferred to sit quietly in the drawing-room, knitting needles, clicking softly, letting her thoughts settle into order. She had learned long ago that truth revealed itself when one considered human nature, petty quarrels, hidden desires, jealousies, and fears. All crimes, however elaborate in execution, stemmed from such simple roots. Greed, for instance, loomed large over the Crane household. Sir Alistair's estate was considerable, and his collection of rare plants had been valued at a small fortune by botanical societies. Lady Crane, as his widow, stood to inherit much, though whispers in the village suggested their marriage had been far from affectionate. A coldness lingered between them, witnessed in the smallest gestures, her relief at the physician's declaration of natural death, her careful composure at the questioning, her faint smile when speaking of his enemies. Was it grief or freedom that smoothed her face when she thought no one looked? Fenton, the butler, had his own shadows. His loyalty to the family was unquestioned, yet loyalty sometimes masked resentment. Miss Marple recalled the tremor in his hands when asked about the ledger. Perhaps it held more than plant records, receipts, financial dealings, debts, even promises best left unfulfilled. A servant in such a household often knew more than the master guessed. If the ledger had contained something incriminating about Fenton, his motive might not have been money, but fear of exposure. The gardener, Mr. Hales, bristled whenever the snowdrop was mentioned, and his eagerness to deny any knowledge had set Miss Marple's mind turning. A gardener would know the symbolism of flowers, their seasons, their meanings. Go snowdrop, out of place in Sir Alistair's exotic collection, carried a message. Remembrance, consolation, sometimes even death. Could it be that Mr. Hales, long under Sir Alistair's command, had left the flower as a signature, defiant and bitter? Or had someone planted it deliberately to frame him, knowing such a clue would fall naturally at his feet? Then there was Lydia, the maid. Poor, trembling Lydia, who had spoken of voices in the night and faltered beneath her mistress's gaze. Hers was not the demeanor of greed nor of arrogance, but of fear. Fear of speaking, fear of silence. She knew something, Miss Marple was certain. But what weighed heavier, her loyalty to Lady Crane or the terror of implicating herself in matters beyond her station? Young women like Lydia were often drawn into secrets not their own, forced into complicity by silence. As Miss Marple weighed these possibilities, she took a slow turn about the gardens. The morning sun glistened on dew-soaked leaves, and birds trilled cheerfully in the hedgerows, oblivious to the tension in the house. She paused by a bed of early roses and thought about Sir Alistair himself. A man of brilliance, yes, but brilliance clouded by arrogance. His rivals in the botanical world would not mourn him. Some might even rejoice. Yet Miss Marple doubted that an enemy from afar had struck him down within his own locked conservatory. Murder was usually an intimate act, rooted in close connections, not distant rivalries. Back in the conservatory, she examined once more the patch of soil. Its dark, loamy texture confirmed her earlier suspicion. It was not from the crane gardens, but from a churchyard or forest floor. And the snowdrop? Its stem had been cleanly cut, as though by careful hands, not plucked at random. This was no accident. Someone had brought it with them, carried it into the glasshouse, and left it as part of the crime. The motive, then, was entwined with meaning. A personal message, not a random token. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple resolved to speak privately with each suspect again. She began with Fenton, catching him in the pantry as he polished the silver. "Such beautiful work," she remarked kindly. "I suppose Sir Alistair must have valued your service highly." The butler's face remained impassive, but his voice cracked slightly as he said, "The master demanded perfection, Miss Marple, nothing less. To serve him was a burden at times." His eyes flicked toward the ledger she mentioned again, and though he denied knowing its whereabouts, the denial was strained. She sensed a man who feared not the loss of his master, but the discovery of something he himself had tried to bury. Her conversation with Mr. Hales proved equally revealing. He boasted of his work, of the orchids and palms that thrived under his care. Yet when Miss Marple gently asked if Sir Alistair had ever threatened to dismiss him, his ruddy face flushed. "Dismiss me? After 20 years? He knew I was the best." He had. Yet pride tinged with anger often concealed vulnerability. Perhaps Sir Alistair had indeed hinted at replacing him, and perhaps the gardener's livelihood, his very identity, had felt endangered. Pride wounded can turn swiftly to vengeance. Lady Crane, when approached, spoke coolly of her late husband's brilliance and failings. He was respected, yes. Loved? No, not by me. She lifted her chin with defiance, as if daring Miss Marple to challenge her. "Do you think me heartless, Miss Marple? Perhaps I am, but years of neglect harden the soul." Her words revealed bitterness, but bitterness alone did not kill. And yet, when asked whether she recognized the snowdrop, she turned pale before recovering her composure. A wildflower, nothing more? Too quick, too firm, as though sealing away something deeply personal. Lastly, Lydia. Miss Marple found her in the scullery, wringing her hands over a pile of dishes. She spoke gently, like a grandmother coaxing a child. "My dear, you are frightened." "But frightened of what? Not of Sir Alistair, surely. He is beyond frightening now." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes as she whispered, "I shouldn't say... I promised." Promised whom? Miss Marple wondered. The girl would not answer, only shaking her head until Miss Marple's soft touch on her arm brought a faint sob. Fear bound her, but it also revealed that she held a piece of the puzzle no one else had dared to admit. By the evening, Miss Marple had gathered her impressions. Greed lingered with Lady Crane. Fear clung to Lydia. Pride and resentment coloured Mr. Hales, and Fenton carried secrets, perhaps financial, perhaps more. Each had motive enough to wish Sir Alistair gone, yet none explained the locked conservatory, the shard of green glass, the missing ledger, and the snowdrop. It was a maze of motives, tangled like the vines curling in the glasshouse. But Miss Marple knew that even the most tangled maze had a path through it. Human nature, after all, was not infinite in variety. People lied, yes, but they lied in familiar ways, out of fear, vanity, or gain. Somewhere in this web of deception, the threads would converge. And when they did, the truth would stand plain against the glass walls of the garden, thread by thread, lie by lie, until the pattern was revealed. Inspector Davis was at his most triumphant when the constable burst into the drawing-room late the following afternoon, mud still clinging to his boots, holding aloft the object that seemed to promise resolution at last, Sir Alistair's missing ledger. Found in a shallow ditch near the village churchyard, the leather-bound book was damp, its pages smudged, but its presence electrified the room. Here was the missing piece, the one absence that had screamed guilt, now recovered, hidden away. "You see," Davis declared, his cheeks flushed with excitement. Tossed there by someone desperate to conceal its contents. We have them now, Miss Marple. We have them. He snapped it open with a flourish, leafing through the pages. At first they contained the expected botanical notations, meticulous records of orchids, soil types, watering schedules. But then near the back, the writing changed. Instead of tidy lists, there were numbers, names, and brief cryptic notes. A column of debts, perhaps, or a record of exchanges. Most damning of all, one name appeared more than once. Hales. The gardener's name stood scrawled in Sir Alister's hand beside sums of money and a note about shortages of stock unaccounted for. Inspector Davis seized upon it like a hawk upon prey. Embezzlement, he cried. The gardener was stealing from him, and when Sir Alister discovered it, Hales killed him to keep it quiet, plain as day. Mr. Hales, dragged into the room from his work in the potting shed, thundered his protests. His face burned red, his fists clenched. I never touched the man. A quarrel, yes, but murder, no, I never harmed him. His wife, arriving breathless at the doorway, cried out that he had been home that night, but Inspector Davis waved her aside. A wife will say anything for her husband. The ledger speaks for itself. He had motive, greed, and he had opportunity. His hands are all over the flowers, the soil. He planted that snowdrop, no doubt, as some twisted flourish. The villagers, hearing of the discovery, began to murmur. A thief, they said, a thief and a murderer, hiding all along beneath the guise of loyal service. The rumor spread like fire. On dry grass, and by evening many already believed the case was solved. Mr. Hales was placed under guard, his protests echoing through the halls until they grew hoarse. Miss Marple, however, sat with her knitting in her lap and her brow slightly furrowed. She had examined the ledger herself before Davis whisked it away, and something troubled her deeply. The gardener's name was there, true, but the handwriting on those final pages had shifted subtly. To most eyes, it would look the same, cramped, precise. But Miss Marple, with her keen eye for stitches gone awry, had noticed the difference. The loops on the letters were sharper, the ink slightly darker, as though written with a different pen. And why would Sir Alister, so methodical, in his botanical records, scrawl accusations so clumsily in the back of his treasured notebook? The snowdrop also refused to be dismissed. If the gardener had planted it, why choose so peculiar a flower, so out of place among his tropical charges? No, that had been chosen for a reason. It carried meaning, and that meaning pointed elsewhere. That evening, as the house grew quiet, Miss Marple strolled once more to the conservatory. The wicker chair still sat in its place, though Sir Alister's body had long been removed. She ran her hand gently along the armrest, noting again the faint scratch on the floor where the chair had been moved. A struggle? Or perhaps repositioned. After death? Nearby, the sliver of green glass she had pocketed days before pressed against her thoughts. Where had it come from, if not the panes above? She thought of bottles, medicine, spirits, poisons. A shard from such a bottle would fit far better than from a window. Later she found Lydia in the scullery, shoulders hunched, hands raw from scrubbing. The girl's eyes darted nervously when Miss Marple spoke. "They say Mr. Hales will hang for this," Miss Marple murmured gently. Lydia's lips trembled. I don't think he did it, ma'am. He might be loud, but not cruel." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Then you must hold firm to that thought, my dear. Truth has a way of pushing through, even in the darkest of gardens." But Lydia would say no more, too bound by promises and fear. By the next morning, Inspector Davis was preparing to send word to Scotland Yard that the matter was settled. His confidence grew with each repetition of his theory, as though rehearsed certainty might transform suspicion into fact. "The ledger condemns him, Miss Marple," he said firmly over breakfast. "What more could we want?" Miss Marple stirred, her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "Evidence, Inspector. Evidence that cannot be planted, nor forged, nor contrived. Tell me, have you asked yourself why the ledger was so conveniently found in the churchyard ditch? A thief might burn it, might hide it in a fire grate or scatter it in the river. But a ditch near enough that it should be discovered within days. That, I fear, is too tidy a clue." Davis bristled. "Are you suggesting someone planted it there?" Not suggesting, Inspector, only observing. People rarely discard what they most fear unless they also mean it to be found. She let the words hang gently, her needles clicking once more. By midday, the village buzzed with certainty. To them, the case was closed. The gardener had stolen, the gardener had killed, the gardener had been caught. Yet Miss Marple felt unease, settling deeper with each passing hour. Too many. Questions remained unanswered. Why had the butler trembled when the ledger was first mentioned, if not from guilt of his own? Why had Lady Crane flinched at the sight of the snowdrop? And why had Lydia, poor child, spoken of voices near midnight? Voices, not a voice. If Sir Alistair had been alone, who had spoken with him? A false victory, Miss Marple thought grimly, was worse than none at all. It lulled the mind, quieted the questions, made the shadows bolder. For if the true hand behind the crime remained free, then the game was far from over. Somewhere in the Crane household, the real culprit watched events unfold with satisfaction, knowing suspicion had been diverted. But Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would not be so easily misled. The gardener's loud denials rang truer than the polished lies of others. No, the web was larger, the motives deeper. The snowdrop still whispered its secret. The green glass still waited to be explained, and the truth still lay hidden within the glass garden, patient as a seed beneath the soil. And seeds, Miss Marple knew, had a way of growing when least expected. The house had grown quieter after Mr. Hales was taken into custody. Whispers still rippled through the village, but inside the Crane estate silence hung heavy, like the pause before a storm. Miss Marple, however, felt no such calm. The supposed resolution unsettled her. The air of triumph that Inspector Davis carried about him seemed premature, and her instincts told her that the story of Sir Alistair's death had far deeper roots. That evening, she sat with Lydia in the kitchen once more, the girl peeling apples with slow, distracted movements. "Tell me, child," Miss Marple began softly, "how long had Mr. Hales been with the family?" "More than 20 years, Lydia replied, eyes cast down. "He came here as a boy, really, barely older than me now. Sir Alistair took him in after his own father died. Said he needed someone with strong hands for the gardens." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Ah, so their lives were entwined far longer than the inspector imagines." Lydia nodded, then glanced about nervously before leaning closer. "But it wasn't always easy between them. They quarrelled sometimes, though most forgot it quickly. Sir Alistair could be sharp with words, and Hales, well, he carried pride like a badge. But murder?" Her voice trembled. "No, I cannot believe it." Miss Marple tucked that away, but it was not the only thread tugging at her mind. Later that night, in the drawing-room, she found Lady Crane sitting alone by the fire. The flickering light caught her face, casting deep shadows under her eyes. She seemed lost in thought until she noticed Miss Marple at the door. "You believe the inspector is wrong," Lady Crane said without preamble. "I believe," Miss Marple replied. Gently, "that truth rarely lies as near the surface as we wish. I have learned that roots run deep, sometimes very deep indeed." Lady Crane's lips pressed together, and for a long moment she was silent. Then, with a sigh, she murmured, "This house has seen tragedies before, Miss Marple. Death is no stranger. Here." At that, Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Tragedies?" she prompted, her voice mild but her mind alight. Lady Crane's gaze lingered on the fire. "Years ago, long before Lydia was born, there was another death. A maid, pretty thing, full of laughter. She died suddenly in the conservatory. The conservatory?" Miss Marple's tone was careful, though her pulse quickened. "Poison," Lady Crane said, voice low. "A bottle of tincture misplaced. They called it an accident, but whispers always followed. They said she had been close to Sir Alistair, too close for a man with a wife." The revelation shifted the ground beneath Miss Marple's thoughts. A death in the conservatory years ago, poison, scandal, whispers, and now Sir Alistair himself dead, again in that same glass chamber, with the faint shard of green glass still unexplained. Was history repeating itself, or had the past finally returned to claim its due? Later, when she was alone, Miss Marple recalled the shard once more. It could have come from a bottle, a medicine vial, or perhaps a tincture, a relic of that long-ago tragedy, or a deliberate echo meant to bind the present crime to the shadows of the past. The next morning she sought out Mr. Hales, still confined to a small cold room off the servants' wing. His face was gaunt from a night without rest. "Mr. Hales," she said kindly, "you have known this household longer than most. You remember things others have chosen to forget." He looked at her warily. "What is it you want of me, ma'am?" "The truth," she answered simply. "About the girl who died in the conservatory years ago." His eyes widened in surprise. He turned away, jaw tightening. "Best left buried, that is." "Buried things," Miss Marple said softly, "have a way of growing roots that push back to the surface. You know this better than anyone." A long silence stretched before Hales finally muttered, "It was no accident. She was given poison, and those who knew it were paid to hold their tongues. But Sir Alistair, he carried the weight of it all. His life never spoke of it, but you could see it in his eyes. Guilt or grief or both, and Lady Crane, she never forgave." Miss Marple felt the pattern shifting again. Lady Crane's bitterness, Sir Alistair's secret shame, a maid's untimely death. The echoes were too strong to ignore, and then there was the snowdrop, a symbol of innocence, of purity lost. Was it not also a flower often planted upon graves? A quiet memorial, perhaps, or a reminder that the past was never truly gone? By afternoon, Miss Marple's suspicions had turned to the butler, Mr. Pembroke. She found him polishing silver in the dining room, his hands steady, but his expression strained. "Mr. Pembroke," she said gently, "you were in service here when the maid died, were you not?" His face paled. "That was long ago, Miss Marple, nothing to do with this." "On the contrary," she replied, her gaze unflinching. "It has everything to do with this. Crimes do not stand alone. They are woven from what came before. Tell me, did Sir Alistair ever speak of her?" Pembroke's hand trembled against the silver tray. "Never, not once." But the silence spoke volumes. And Lady Crane, well, she made it her duty to erase the girl from memory. No photograph, no trinket, no mention. But I remember Miss Marple. I remember her laughter. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The truth was, edging closer, someone in this house had decided that the past must not be forgotten, and had marked Sir Alistair with the same fate once visited upon that girl. That evening, as the wind rattled the panes of the conservatory, Miss Marple stood among the flowers once more. She looked at the snowdrop, at the faint scratch on the floor where the chair had been moved, at the shadows that clung to the corners. "Sir, Alistair's death was not merely a matter of greed or theft. It was a reckoning, a thread pulled from years past, woven tightly into the present. The maid's death, buried beneath whispers, had resurfaced like a ghost demanding justice. Someone had remembered. Someone had carried the bitterness of the past into the present moment and struck when the opportunity arose. The gardener was innocent of murder. Miss Marple felt it now with certainty. The true hand lay elsewhere, among those who remembered the conservatory not as a place of beauty, but as a place of death. She closed her eyes, listening to the echoes of laughter long silenced, and whispered to herself, "The past casts long shadows, and within those shadows the truth still waits, still." The morning after her quiet reflections in the glasshouse, Miss Marple found herself strolling through the village lanes with her usual basket in hand. To passers-by, she appeared to be simply shopping for bread and preserves, but in truth, her mind was turning over the puzzle of Sir Alistair's death with increasing urgency. The inspector might be content with his arrested gardener, but Miss Marple knew better. She needed something more, a small spark that would burn away the shadows of deception. Unconventional means sometimes revealed what straight questions could not. Over the years, she had discovered that people showed more of themselves in what they did when unguarded than in anything they confessed under direct inquiry. The key, she thought, was to set the stage and then simply watch. That afternoon, she made a small request of Lady Crane, permission to host a tea for remembrance in the conservatory. "It is such a lovely place, even now," she said gently, "and I think it would comfort the staff to gather there. Sir Alistair would not have wished the flowers to stand in mourning." Lady Crane, weary but pliant, agreed. And so by late afternoon, the conservatory was filled again. Lady Crane, Lydia, Mr. Pembroke the butler, the housekeeper Mrs. Danvers, and even Inspector Davis, who attended reluctantly, grumbling about wasted time. Miss Marple presided at the head of the long wicker table, her knitting bag beside her, her eyes keen though her demeanour mild. The tactic was simple. In ordinary conversation, truths and lies tangled together. But when one invoked memory, when one asked people to recall a moment, a feeling, or a detail, they often betrayed themselves by what they chose to emphasize, or by the cracks in their composure. As teacups were passed around, Miss Marple began with gentle reminiscence. "Sir Alistair had such a fondness for orchids," she said lightly. "Do you remember the way he spoke of them as though they were jewels rather than flowers?" Lady Crane gave a curt nod, while Mr. Pembroke managed a faint smile. Lydia spoke warmly, recalling how Sir Alistair had once shown her a rare bloom that only opened at night. All responses, Miss Marple noted, were fitting, measured, and sincere. Then she let the conversation turn. "And yet," she said softly, "for all his orchids, I find it curious that a snowdrop was found at his side. A strange thing, so out. Dove season, almost like a whisper from another time." The silence that followed was subtle, but not silent enough. Lydia tilted her head with innocent confusion. The inspector grunted in dismissal, but Lady Crane's teacup clinked too sharply against its saucer. And Mr. Pembroke, though his face remained neutral, shifted his chair a fraction away from the table, as though retreating into shadow. Miss Marple continued smoothly, pretending not to notice. "I remember, when I was a girl, that snowdrops were often planted to mark a grave. Such a gentle token. Of course, that is only an old country custom." This time Lady Crane's lips tightened, her gaze fixed on her teacup. Mr. Pembroke's hand froze altogether on the silver tongs. It was Mrs. Danvers, bless her, who broke the silence by muttering, "Never did care for snowdrops myself." The inspector scoffed. "Flowers on graves, country tales, it's all nonsense." But Miss Marple saw the tension ripple through her suspects, and she knew she had touched upon something raw. She pressed the advantage. "Funny, too," she mused aloud, "how glass can carry echoes. A vial shattered, perhaps. A mistake repeated. Memory does have a way of haunting the places where it once left a mark." The butler dropped the tongs. A metallic clatter rang against the tray. And in that sound Miss Marple heard more than nerves. It was guilt, tightly bound, suddenly loosening. His face, pale as parchment, betrayed him before he spoke. Miss Marple let the moment pass, returning to her tea with grandmotherly calm. The others relaxed, grateful the moment had not been pressed further. But she had seen what she needed. The butler's mask had cracked, and Lady Crane's brittle composure was wearing thin. Later, when the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple asked Lydia to help tidy the table. Away from listening ears, she said gently, "Did you notice, child, how Mr. Pembroke trembled when the snowdrop was mentioned?" Lydia's brow furrowed. "Yes, and Lady Crane looked as though she might cry." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. "Because neither of them think of snowdrops as merely flowers. They think of graves." The girl shivered, but Miss Marple patted her hand. "It is in those tiny cracks, my dear, that the truth begins to shine through. People can pretend for years, but the heart remembers what the tongue dares not say." That night, as Miss Marple walked home beneath the clear, cold stars, she replayed the afternoon in her mind. The unusual experiment had yielded results, two reactions that could not be explained away. Lady Crane had tightened into silence at the thought of graves. Mr. Pembroke had nearly exposed himself in his shock. The inspector might call it coincidence. He might insist that the gardener's key in the soil was proof enough. But Miss Marple knew better. The snowdrop was not random. The shard of glass was not meaningless. They were the remnants of an old sorrow, an old crime, carried into the present by hands that had not forgotten. And now, thanks to one small, unconventional trick, she had seen who those hands might belong. To the butler and the widow, linked by their silence, betrayed by their reactions. The question was no longer whether they knew something, The question was how far they had gone to hide it. As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "Yes, the glass garden holds more than flowers. It holds memory. And memory, if one listens closely, always speaks." The following morning dawned grey and heavy, a mist lying low over St. Giles, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple arrived early at the Crane estate, knitting bag in hand, only to find the household in a state of agitation. The normally composed Mrs. Danvers was wringing her hands in the hallway, and Inspector Davis stormed past with his notebook half open, barking orders to constables who scurried like unsettled mice. "What has happened?" Miss Marple asked. Her voice calm despite the commotion. Mrs. Danvers leaned close, whispering as though the walls themselves might be listening. "The ledger, miss. Sir Alistair's little leather book, the one he always kept by him. It's gone. Vanished from the study in the night." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. That ledger, already missing on the night of the death, had been recovered only yesterday from a locked cabinet in Sir Alistair's private study. Inspector Davis had declared it vital evidence, for within its pages were records of rare plants, shipments received, and notations in Sir Alistair's neat hand. But more importantly, the last pages had been smeared and partially torn, as though someone had tried to conceal a particular entry. Now it had disappeared again. Miss Marple entered the study to find Davis red-faced with fury. "This is deliberate obstruction," he fumed, slamming his fist against the desk. "Only those within the household could have taken it. I'll have the place turned upside down if I must." But Miss Marple's voice, quiet though it was, cut through his bluster. Turning things upside down often scatters the pieces farther. Better, I think, to ask who had most to lose if the truth written within those pages were read. The inspector scoffed. "You think it's the butler or the widow? Always the obvious suspects with you." She smiled faintly. "I think, Inspector, that obviousness can be both a trap and a disguise." Still, the fact could not be denied. The ledger had vanished. A crucial link between past and present had been stolen away, and its absence rattled everyone. The house was no longer merely grieving. It was guarded, tense, as though each person feared the eyes of the others. Lady Crane kept to her room, refusing to descend. Lydia, pale and wide-eyed, clutched at Miss Marple's hand in the corridor. "They say the gardener will hang for this now," she whispered. "Without that book, how can anyone prove otherwise?" Miss Marple patted her gently. "Do not despair, child. When evidence vanishes, it is often because it speaks too loudly. We need only to listen for its echo." That afternoon, she contrived to examine the study herself. The lock on the cabinet where the ledger had been placed was intact, no signs of force, which meant the thief had possessed either the key or the cooperation of someone who did. On the desk she noted a faint trace of soil, a few grains lodged in the grooves of the wood. Not the sandy soil of the conservatory, but the same darker loam she had touched when she first examined the snowdrop. She let her hand rest lightly on it, her thoughts circling. The churchyard soil again. Someone had left it here without noticing, carried on their sleeve or shoe. A careless trace, but one that spoke volumes. By evening, the household's unease had deepened into suspicion. Mr. Pembroke kept his head bowed as he served dinner, though his hands shook when he set the silver down. Lady Crane appeared at table, only briefly, her face pale before retreating again to her chambers. Mrs. Danvers muttered under her breath about wickedness loose in the house. Even Inspector Davis seemed subdued, though he continued to insist loudly that the missing ledger proved the gardener's guilt. Miss Marple watched them all with careful patience. She knew that when evidence vanished, it was rarely destroyed, outright. No, such things were usually hidden, moved, concealed until the moment was safe. And the concealment itself could be as telling as the evidence it sought to suppress. That night, she asked Lydia to fetch her some tea. While waiting, she rose from her chair in the sitting room and wandered, apparently absent-mindedly, into the hall. There she paused at the great-grandfather clock. The pendulum swung steadily, its tick-tock soothing in the silence. And yet something struck her as odd. The small compartment at its base, often used in old houses to store candles or polish, was slightly ajar. Bending carefully, Miss Marple opened it. Inside lay nothing more than a cloth and a candlestick, or so it seemed at first glance, but tucked beneath the cloth was the faintest edge of leather. Her fingers brushed it, but before she could draw it out, footsteps echoed down the hall. She closed the compartment quickly and turned, her expression mild as Inspector Davis appeared. "Still snooping, Miss Marple," he said, with faint irritation. "Merely admiring the craftsmanship," she replied sweetly. "Grandfather clocks always remind me of my childhood." He grunted and moved on. Only when the sound of his boots faded did she permit herself a small smile. The ledger had not been destroyed. It had been hidden close at hand within the clock itself. The thief had not counted on her eyes noticing what others overlooked, but to retrieve it openly would be unwise. For if she had stumbled upon the hiding place, so too could she have been seen. Better to wait, to observe and to learn who came creeping back to reclaim it. That night Miss Marple retired early, but she did not sleep. Instead she kept watch from the shadows of the corridor outside her room, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Hours passed, the house settling into silence. Then, sometime past midnight, a figure moved softly through the hall. Tall, careful, deliberate, the silhouette unmistakably that of Mr. Pembroke, the butler. He paused at the grandfather clock, glancing over his shoulder before kneeling. His hand slipped into the compartment, withdrawing the ledger swiftly. For an instant the lamplight caught his face, tense, strained, not with the calm efficiency of duty, but with fear. Miss Marple did not move, did not speak. She let him pass, gliding away into the dark with his prize clutched close. But she knew then that the missing evidence had told her far more than the inspector's blustering ever could. Someone was working against the truth, yes, but in doing so they had revealed their own hand. When at last she returned to her room, she whispered to herself, "The glass garden has its secrets, but secrets are like flowers. Hide them too long, and they wither. Soon enough, they must be brought into the light." The morning after Miss Marple's silent vigil, the Crane estate was unsettled in a new, uneasy way. The household moved about as if expecting some storm to break, voices hushed, eyes darting. Miss Marple kept her own counsel, though she could not dismiss the image of Mr. Pembroke stealing through the hall with the ledger clutched in his hands. She had seen too many cases to mistake such fear for innocence, yet she hesitated to reveal what she had witnessed. Timing, she knew, was everything. A bird startled too soon would take flight before its wings could be clipped. For now she watched. The day passed quietly, until evening brought a sudden disturbance. It was Lydia's cry that rang through the corridors, a sharp note of panic that sent everyone running. Miss Marple, swift despite her age, reached the conservatory first. There, by the great wrought-iron door, Lydia stood trembling, her face white as linen. "What is it, child?" "Miss," Marple asked, her voice steady. "It's Mr. Pembroke," Lydia whispered, pointing with a shaking hand. And indeed there he was, slumped across the tiled floor, his body half hidden by the shadow of a towering fern. His face was ashen, his lips tinged blue, and in his rigid hand lay the very same leather-bound ledger. Inspector Davis, arriving, moments later gave a triumphant shout. "He's poisoned himself. Guilt drove him to it. Case closed." But Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing. She bent low, examining the scene with quiet precision. The ledger was open, but its pages were blank, utterly blank. Not one inked word, not one smeared line. She touched the corner lightly, then looked up. "This is not the same book that vanished," she murmured. "It is a decoy." Her gaze shifted to the teacup lying shattered beside the butler's outstretched arm. A bitter scent clung to the shards, sharp and unmistakable, strychnine. Not the slow, subtle work of guilt, but the cruel swiftness of deliberate poisoning. "No," she said softly, rising to her feet. "Mr. Pembroke did not take his own life. He was silenced." The words rippled through the room, striking like stones upon still water. Lydia gasped. Lady Crane clutched at the doorway for support, and Mrs. Danvers crossed herself in horror. Inspector Davis, flushed with embarrassment, muttered that she was letting her imagination run wild, but Miss Marple remained calm, her mind already tracing the hidden hand that had guided this second crime. It was a bold move, she realized. To kill once within the confines of the house might be explained away by chance or opportunity. But twice, this was something else. A murderer still moved among them, clever enough to stay ahead, ruthless enough to strike again when threatened. And if Mr. Pembroke had held the true ledger, then its secrets were now lost with him. Later in the drawing room, the atmosphere was strained to breaking. Inspector Davis attempted to question the household, but fear had loosened tongues into confusion. Lady Crane insisted she had been in her chamber when the cry was raised. Lydia swore she had only entered the conservatory to fetch flowers for the table. Mrs. Danvers wept openly, declaring the house cursed. Miss Marple, her knitting needles flashing steadily in her lap, observed them all. It was not words she listened to, but tones, the quaver of fear, the tremor of deceit, the silence where truth should have been. She addressed Lydia gently. "You say you came for flowers, my dear." "Which ones?" the girl faltered. "Snowdrops," she whispered, then caught herself. "No, I meant orchids, of course." A silence followed, sharp and uneasy. Miss Marple said nothing more, but her eyes lingered on the girl until she flushed scarlet and looked away. It was not guilt she saw there, but something else. Fear. And perhaps knowledge too dangerous for her young lips to speak. That night Miss Marple did not return to her cottage. She insisted upon staying in the house, citing her concern for Lydia's safety. The inspector grumbled, but Lady Crane consented, almost with relief. The atmosphere was brittle, like glass under strain. One more crack, and the whole might shatter, as the house settled into uneasy slumber. Miss Marple sat in the conservatory, alone among the orchids and the shadows. She studied the place where Pembroke had fallen, her sharp eyes noting the absence of soil this time. Whoever killed him had taken care not to leave behind the same careless trace as before. A lesson learned, perhaps, but in learning it, the killer had shown awareness of what had been noticed. That thought chilled her. The murderer was not merely ruthless, but watchful. They knew what she had seen, what she suspected. They were not only several steps ahead, but close, so very close, like a shadow moving just out of sight. As the clock in the hall chimed midnight, Miss Marple whispered into the still air, "This is no longer about finding justice for Sir Alistair alone. If the truth does not come swiftly, there will be another death." The orchids rustled faintly, as though stirred by some unseen draught, their pale petals gleaming in the lamplight. The glass garden was no longer merely a place of beauty. It was a trap, a stage, a tomb waiting to be filled again. The Crane estate was shrouded in dread the morning after Mr. Pembroke's death. The servants whispered of curses, the inspector muttered of confessions yet to be wrung, and Lady Crane shut herself behind locked doors, refusing even the comfort of company. Fear thickened in the air, clinging to the house like ivy to stone. Yet Miss Marple, though grave of face, moved with quiet purpose. She had seen such fear before, fear that bred confusion, fear that blinded people to the very clues before their eyes. The inspector, his pride bruised by the butler's silencing, raged about treachery within the household. First, the master, now the servant, he declared. "Mark my words, Miss Marple, this house will give me my culprit yet." Miss Marple only inclined her head. "It already has, Inspector. The trouble is, none of us have yet read the signs clearly enough." She retreated to the conservatory, her natural place of reflection. The orchids swayed in their humid air, pale blossoms glowing faintly in the morning light. There, with her knitting in her lap, she let her mind run back over every detail. The snowdrop by Sir Alistair's chair, the missing ledger, the loam out of place, the trembling hands of the butler, the silences of the widow, and always behind it all the echo of another death long ago, a maid silenced by poison in this very room. Patterns, she knew, were like stitches in her knitting. One might see only loops and tangles until suddenly the design revealed itself. And then it seemed astonishing it had not been clear all along. The first thread tugged free when Lydia entered quietly, a small basket of cut flowers in her arms. She hesitated before setting it down, avoiding Miss Marple's eyes. "For the table," she murmured. Miss Marple, with gentle cunning, reached out to touch one stem. "Orchids again, dear?" "Yes, of course," Lydia said too quickly. But among the orchids lay something else, one fragile, trembling snowdrop. Out of season, out of place, exactly like the one beside Sir Alister's body. Lydia saw where her gaze fell and flushed scarlet. It was in the garden by the old stone wall. I thought it pretty, that's all. Miss Marple's voice was kind, but firm. And yet, you told me last night you had come to fetch orchids when you stumbled upon poor Mr. Pembroke. Why lie about a flower? The girl's lips trembled, but she said nothing. She hurried away, leaving the basket behind. Miss Marple sighed softly. Lydia was not guilty, but she knew more than she dared reveal. The snowdrops were not mere tokens of beauty. They were symbols. Someone had planted them deliberately, years out of season, to mark both deaths. Later that afternoon, as she sat in the drawing-room, Miss Marple overheard Lady Crane speaking sharply to Mrs. Danvers. "I told you never to bring those flowers into this house again," she hissed, before noticing Miss Marple's quiet presence and falling instantly silent. That was the second thread. Lady Crane's aversion was not mere dislike, it was hatred, hatred bound up with memory. Snowdrops were not only symbols of innocence, they were reminders of the maid who had died in the conservatory, buried in the churchyard beneath a row of them. Lady Crane had sought to erase that girl's memory, and now the flowers had returned, marking the deaths of those who might reveal the truth. The third thread came quite by accident. Inspector Davis, blustering about the house, dropped a set of keys upon the carpet. Miss Marple bent to retrieve them and noticed a small one, brass and finely worn. "The conservatory cabinet key," he explained gruffly, "where I put the ledger before it vanished." But Miss Marple frowned. The lock on that cabinet was not brass but iron. She had seen it herself. Which meant this brass key was not for the cabinet at all, but for something else, something smaller. A private drawer, perhaps, or a box. When the inspector stomped off, she examined the key more closely. A faint smear of dark loam clung to its edge. The same loam she had found on the desk, the same loam by the snowdrop. Someone had used this key to open something hidden, then handled the earth that had carried the flower inside. Suddenly the pattern revealed itself. It was not the butler, though his silence had cost him his life. It was not the gardener, though his quarrels made him suspect. It was not even Lydia, though her innocence made her clumsy in lies. No, the hand behind it all belonged to someone who hated snowdrops, someone who had every reason to bury the eye. Memory of that long-ago maid, someone with keys to every locked door in the house. Lady Crane. The realization did not strike like lightning, but unfolded like dawn creeping through the glass panes of the conservatory. It explained the aversion, the trembling silences, the hidden ledger, where Sir Alister may have recorded not merely plants, but names, gifts, debts, secrets his widow could not allow to surface. It explained Mr. Pembroke's death, too, for he had known or guessed and had become too dangerous to be left alive. Miss Marple sat very still, her needles idle, as the pattern settled into place. The snowdrop was no accident. It was a cruel reminder, chosen by the one person who despised. Its presence most, chosen to mask guilt beneath a symbol of innocence. Yet knowledge alone was not enough. Proof was needed, and in a house where evidence vanished, the truth would not be easy to hold. Still, Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest smile. She had unraveled the pattern. Now she need only follow its threads to the final stitch. Outside, the mist was lifting, sunlight breaking across the garden. But within the glass house of secrets, shadows still lingered, and Miss Marple knew the murderer's hand was not yet done. Evening settled over the Crane estate like a suffocating shroud. The inspector prowled the corridors, his voice sharp with impatience, demanding statements, demanding order, demanding answers that continually eluded him. The servants moved like ghosts, speaking in whispers, their eyes darting toward locked doors and curtained windows. Somewhere in this house of glass and shadows, a killer still breathed the same air as the rest of them. Miss Marple sat in her chair in the conservatory, her needles silent upon her lap. The orchids glistened with dew, and in the corner of the room the basket Lydia had abandoned still lay untouched. its single snowdrop drooping, pale and trembling, as if weighed by the very sins it symbolized. The old woman's gaze lingered on it, her thoughts knitting a picture more terrible than even she had first imagined. Lady Crane entered without sound, her silks rustling faintly. Her face, beautiful still in its severity, was marked by sleeplessness. She carried herself with brittle dignity, chin high, but her eyes betrayed a deep unease. She paused upon seeing Miss Marple, and her expression flickered with irritation. "You linger in this room, Miss Marple, as though it holds answers, but it contains only flowers and glass. The inspector will waste no time on them." "Perhaps he should," Miss Marple replied gently. "Flowers tell us more than we think. They carry memories, associations, meanings. For some they bring comfort, for others, pain." Lady Crane stiffened. "I despise snowdrops," she said abruptly, almost too quickly. "They are weeds masquerading as beauty, best torn up and burned." "But you see," Miss Marple said, her tone soft, almost kindly, "they are not weeds at all. They are symbols of innocence, and perhaps that is what you despise most, because innocence once destroyed can never be restored." For a long moment's silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of the conservatory lamps. Then Lady Crane laughed, a brittle, cracking sound. "You are a foolish old woman." "Foolish, perhaps," Miss Marple said, rising with difficulty, her eyes never leaving Lady Crane's face. "But I am not blind. Sir Alistair's death, Mr. Pembroke's silencing, the ledger that vanished, and now these flowers. It is not money or land that binds them. It is memory. Memory of that poor maid who died here long ago." The widow's eyes flickered, and in that flicker Miss Marple saw the truth. "You hated her," Miss Marple said softly, "not for what she did, but for what she was. Youthful, alive, beloved by Sir Alistair, in a way that stung more deeply than any insult. She was a reminder that his affections strayed, that his devotion was not yours alone." Lady Crane's composure faltered. Her hands gripped the back of a chair until the knuckles whitened. "He would have ruined us," she whispered fiercely. "That girl meant nothing, nothing but disgrace. He was preparing to leave me, to bring her into this house as if she could replace me. Me." "And so she died," Miss Marple murmured, silenced before she could step into the light. Poisoned in this very conservatory, her body carried away beneath the cover of night. And Sir Alistair, he knew. He buried his guilt in his books, in his plants, in his ledgers, but guilt festers. And now, so many years later, it came to bloom. Again. Lady Crane's eyes glittered with sudden, sharp fury. "Do you think I would let him betray me twice? Even in death he would not escape me. He meant to confess, to publish his precious notes, to let the truth spill out and blacken my name. And that butler, that meddling Pembroke, he suspected, always watching, always prying. They left me no choice." Her voice trembled. "But there was no regret in it, only the raw ache of pride. I endured a lifetime at his side, Miss Marple. Do you know what it is to be humiliated in silence? To watch your husband favor another, a servant girl of all things, while you smiled and played the dutiful lady? I preserved my name, my place, my dignity. I did what was necessary." Miss Marple studied her with quiet sorrow. "At what cost, Lady Crane? A girl's life, then a man's, then another. And all for dignity? For pride?" Lady Crane drew herself up, regal and unyielding even in confession. "Yes, for dignity, for the preservation of what was mine. You call it pride, I call it survival. Without him, without this house, what am I? An aging woman to be cast aside? No, Miss Marple, I would sooner stain my hands than allow myself to be erased." The truth hung heavy in the air, darker than greed, crueler than jealousy. It was not money, nor power, nor even revenge. It was fear, the fear of being forgotten, replaced, rendered invisible. A fear that had driven Lady Crane to sacrifice innocence itself, to smother it beneath snowdrops and silence. Miss Marple bowed her head, her voice low and grave. "It was never your dignity at risk, my dear, only your heart, and in trying to protect it, you hardened it until no warmth could remain." The widow's face crumpled, if only for an instant. But then, like glass cooling after fire, it hardened once more. She turned her gaze away toward the orchids gleaming pale in the lamplight. "The inspector will need proof," she said coldly. "And proof you do not have," Miss Marple said. Nothing. She only watched as Lady Crane swept from the conservatory, her silhouette tall and proud, though her steps faltered on the threshold. The old woman lowered herself back into her chair, her needles clicking once more. Proof. Yes, it would be. Needed. But the motive was laid bare now, and it was uglier, more human than anyone had wished to believe. This was not a crime of fortune or convenience. It was the cry of a heart that could not endure humiliation, a heart that chose death for others rather than obscurity for itself. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, knew she must find the one thread left to tug, the one stitch that would unravel Lady Crane's web entirely. The following day dawned sharp and cold, frost lining the glass panes of the conservatory. The orchids inside glistened, their delicate petals breathing life into a room now thick with secrets. Lady Crane kept to her chambers, unseen save for the occasional command carried to the servants. The inspector, though restless, was little closer to a solution than before. He stormed through the corridors with bluster, unaware that the truth he sought so fiercely had already been coaxed into light by the quiet woman knitting in the glass garden. Miss Marple knew the time had come. A crime such as this could not remain a shadow, not when more lives were at stake. She had seen the desperation in Lady Crane's eyes, a woman who believed her world was crumbling, who would strike again if cornered. The trap must be set delicately, for one wrong move might drive the widow to violence, or worse, to silence herself forever. The opportunity presented itself at dinner, a subdued affair served in the grand dining hall. Only a handful of seats were filled. The inspector at one end, grim and impatient, Lydia sitting pale and withdrawn, Mr. Denby hunched over his plate, eyes darting nervously, and Lady Crane presiding at the head, regal despite the shadows under her eyes. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the side, let her knitting needles rest in her lap. Conversation faltered quickly. The inspector attempted to draw remarks from Lady Crane, but she answered in clipped tones. It was then that Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the table. "It is curious," she said mildly, "how certain flowers linger in memory. Snowdrops, for instance. They seem to bloom here even out of season and always near the dead." The room stilled. Lydia's fork slipped against her plate with a soft clatter. Mr. Denby looked up sharply, his brow furrowed. Lady Crane's hands froze, her knife poised above the roast. Miss Marple continued, her tone deceptively gentle. "I noticed yesterday that one grew near the chair where Sir Alister fell, and again a snowdrop placed with orchids in a basket meant for the table. But of course snowdrops should not bloom now, should they? Unless they were planted deliberately." Lady Crane's gaze hardened, but she said nothing. The inspector frowned. "What of it, Miss Marple? A flower is hardly evidence of murder." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, her eyes never leaving Lady Crane's. "It is a signature. Long ago, when a maid died in this house, poisoned in fact, her grave was planted with snowdrops. A tender tribute from Sir Alister, perhaps, but for some those flowers became not a symbol of innocence, but of betrayal." A tremor passed across Lady Crane's face, quickly masked but not quickly enough. Miss Marple pressed on. "Sir Alister knew his guilt, and he wrote it down, in his ledger, among the records of plants. That ledger disappeared, yet I found traces of soil upon the brass key you claimed was for the conservatory cabinet, soil from the same patch where the snowdrops bloom." The inspector sat bolt upright. "By God, are you saying—" "I am saying," Miss Marple said firmly, "that Lady Crane retrieved that ledger. She feared what it revealed, that it would expose her hand in a death long past. And when Sir Alister, burdened with conscience, sought to confess, she silenced him. Mr. Pembroke, too. He had grown too suspicious, too watchful. The snowdrops were not left by chance. They were tokens of her triumph, though she hated their sight." The widow rose to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. Her eyes blazed with fury. "You dare sit in my house and accuse me of such vile acts? You, a meddling old woman?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm, though the room crackled with tension. "I dare because the truth must be spoken, And because you know as well as I that no one else in this house had both the means and the motive. You alone despised the snowdrops. You alone had reason to silence those who threatened your pride. And you alone held the keys. The inspector stood ready to move, but Lady Crane's next action stopped him cold. She seized the carving knife from the table, her hand trembling but resolute. The servants gasped, Lydia cried out, and Mr. Denby stumbled back from his seat. For an instant it seemed the widow might strike. But Miss Marple did not flinch. She looked upon Lady Crane with a steady, sorrowful gaze. "Put it down, my dear. This path ends only in ruin. Your husband is beyond your reach now, as is that girl, long gone. You have fought so hard to keep dignity, but what dignity lies in bloodshed? Think of Lydia, who still looks to you for guidance. Do not rob her of what little love remains." Lady Crane's hand shook violently, the knife wavering in the air. For a long, breathless moment, the room teetered upon the edge of violence. Then, with a sudden cry, half fury, half despair, she let the knife clatter to the floor. Her composure crumbled. She pressed her hands to her face, her body shaking with sobs that tore from her like cracks in glass. "I did it," she whispered, hoarsely. "I did what I must. He would have destroyed me. They all would have destroyed me." The inspector moved swiftly, signaling his men. 2 constables stepped forward from the doorway where they had been placed at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion. They took hold of Lady Crane gently but firmly. She offered no resistance, her strength spent. The room was silent save for her weeping. Lydia sat frozen, her wide eyes filled with horror and pity. The inspector, though grim, cast Miss Marple a look of grudging respect. "You had it all in hand, didn't you, madam?" Miss Marple lowered her gaze to her knitting, where a single row of stitches waited to be finished. "It is only a matter of patience, Inspector. Patterns reveal themselves if one has the eye to see." The widow was led from the room, her sobs fading into the corridors. In her absence the air felt lighter, though no less sorrowful. For what had been uncovered was not merely crime, but the terrible cost of pride and fear, festering through the years until it consumed all that remained. Miss Marple gathered her needles and yarn, her face serene though her heart was heavy. The confrontation was over, but she knew the story was not yet finished. For every crime there remained the question of justice, and whether it would heal or deepen the wounds left behind. The Crane estate breathed easier in the days that followed Lady Crane's arrest. The servants, once ghost-like in their dread, began to move with tentative relief. Inspector Davis, though weary from paperwork and declarations, carried himself with the proud air of a man who believed the storm had passed. The newspapers clamored with headlines of the Glass Garden murders, painting Lady Crane as a cold and calculating widow whose pride had driven her to unspeakable crimes. Justice, it seemed, had been done, yet Miss Marple felt no such ease. She had seen Lady Crane's breakdown with her own eyes, the fury, the desperation, the confession wrung from her by despair. And though the motive had been laid bare, though the evidence aligned neatly, there lingered in her mind one small untidy detail, a detail that clung stubbornly, like a loose thread refusing to be woven into the pattern. She found it while sitting again in the conservatory, her knitting in her lap, her eyes drawn inevitably toward the orchids. The snowdrop basket was gone, removed after that dreadful dinner, yet she recalled it vividly. One flower had trembled in the lamplight, its stem bruised, not plucked carefully from the soil, but broken hastily, roughly, as if by a hand not accustomed to gentleness. Lady Crane, for all her hatred of snowdrops, had never laid hands upon them. Her aversion was too strong. Even her fury could not have compelled her to touch them bare-handed. That had struck Miss Marple even then, though she had put it aside amid the chaos. Now, with the house quiet, the thought returned with piercing clarity. If Lady Crane had not placed the snowdrops, who had? The answer came with an unexpected visitor. Lydia entered the conservatory late that afternoon, her face pale but composed. She carried a small parcel in her hands, wrapped in linen. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I cannot keep this any longer." The old woman beckoned her closer. Lydia set the parcel upon the table and unfolded the cloth. Inside lay Sir Alister's missing ledger. Its cover was worn, the corners smudged with soil. "I took it," Lydia confessed, her eyes brimming with tears. "That night after Mr. Pembroke died, I was afraid they would blame me, and I thought, if I hid it, perhaps everything would stop." Miss Marple opened the ledger with careful hands. The pages were filled with Sir Alistair's neat script, rows of plant names, sketches, notes in the margins. But near the back, pressed between pages, were several dried snowdrops, fragile as paper. Beside them, a line written in his own hand. "She was not poisoned by chance. Someone placed the glass in her hand." Lydia trembled. "It wasn't Lady Crane, Miss Marple. She may have hated that maid, yes, but she was too proud to soil her hands. Sir Alistair knew who had done it. He wrote it here in his private notes. He meant to expose the truth before he died." Miss Marple read the next line, her eyes narrowing. "Pembroke suspects. He will not remain silent. If I falter, he will know whom to name." And beneath, written in a different hand altogether, hasty, jagged, filled with panic, was a final scrawl: "Better silence than disgrace." Miss Marple closed the book slowly. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it often, in ledgers and receipts, in labels placed around the conservatory. It was Mr. Denby's. The revelation struck like a bell. Denby, the gardener, whose quarrels had seemed petty, whose loyalty appeared unquestioned. He had been the one to handle the soil, the one whose hands carried the loam. He had been the one to pluck snowdrops from the earth, using them as tokens of fear and guilt. He had poisoned the maid long ago, not out of love or hate, but to protect Lady Crane's dignity, to shield her from scandal and secure his own position. And when Sir Alistair sought to unburden himself, Denby silenced him. Pembroke, too. Lady Crane had been complicit, yes, she had allowed the crime to remain buried, but she had not wielded the poison. Miss Marple felt a cold shiver. The true mastermind was not the proud widow, but the man who had devoted his life to her house, her gardens, her name, a servant so loyal he had become monstrous in his devotion. She turned to Lydia, who watched her anxiously. "Does your grandmother know of this?" Lydia shook her head. "She suspects nothing. She thought the snowdrops were her curse alone. She despised them so much she never wondered who placed them there. But I saw Denby, Miss Marple. I saw him, carrying them into the house the night Sir Alistair died. The final piece slid into place. Lady Crane had confessed because she believed herself guilty, bound by the memory of her hatred and her silence. But the true architect had always been the gardener, faithful, quiet, unseen. He had sacrificed others to preserve the dignity of a woman who never asked for his devotion. That night Miss Marple found the inspector, still congratulating himself in the study. She laid the ledger before him, open to the damning page. Frowned, then paled as understanding dawned. "Denby," he muttered. "All this time, Denby." The inspector summoned his men at once, and they found the gardener in the glass-house, tending orchids by lamplight, as though nothing had changed. When confronted, his face twisted not with fear, but with a weary kind of pride. "I did what she could not," he said quietly. "I protected her. I protected the house. Without me, she would have been ruined decades ago. She owes me everything." Miss Marple, standing nearby, shook her head. "No, Mr. Denby. She owes you nothing but sorrow. You chained her to guilt she did not earn, and you carried out crimes in her name that she never commanded. That is not loyalty, that is vanity disguised as love." For the first time, Denby faltered. His shoulders slumped, the years pressing down upon him all at once. "Then what was it for?" he whispered. "What was it all for?" The inspector's men led him away, his footsteps heavy. Lady Crane, when told the truth, broke into bitter sobs, not of innocence, but of wasted years. She had borne guilt. That was not hers, while the true hand moved in silence beside her all along. Miss Marple sat once more among the orchids, her knitting needles clicking softly. Justice had twisted one last time, shifting beneath their feet, but at last the pattern was complete. Two hearts, bound by pride and devotion, had conspired across decades to preserve a dignity that had never truly existed. And in the end, it had destroyed them both. The storm that had hung over the Crane estate for so long did not break with Denby's arrest. If anything, it deepened. The newspapers rushed to rewrite their stories, exchanging one villain for another. The gardener of death, the poisoner in the glass house, headlines bellowed across London by morning. Yet inside the Crane household, there was no triumph. Lady Crane, frail and hollow-eyed, sat in her chamber, staring endlessly into the fire. Lydia remained by her side, torn between pity and resentment. And Denby, steadfast even in shackles, waited in the inspector's custody, with a silence that chilled more than any outburst could. Inspector Davis, though embarrassed by his near mistake, clung to the solidity of evidence. "It's as clear as daylight, Miss Marple," he said. "Pacing the study, the ledger, the handwriting, the flowers, even the motive, all of it ties back to him. We've got our man at last." But Miss Marple, seated in her usual armchair with her knitting, tilted her head and smiled faintly. "Yes, Inspector. But do you understand why the others did not see it? Do you see how cleverly he hid in plain sight?" The inspector frowned, his pride stung. "You mean to say it was obvious all along?" "Not obvious, Inspector. Merely simple." Her needles clicked softly. "The truth always is, when one looks past the smoke and mirrors." She began to explain, not only for Davis's benefit, but for Lydia, who had joined them to hear what truly bound the tale together. "The snowdrops," she said. "So small, so delicate. And yet they told the whole story. Lady Crane despised them. She could not bring herself to touch them, even when rage consumed her. Yet snowdrops appeared at every scene. Who then placed them? A man whose hands worked daily in the soil. A man who believed himself guardian of the estate even above its mistress." Lydia nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "Then there was the timing," Miss Marple continued. "Sir Alistair, that poor man, sought to confess. He knew too much and he feared the weight of secrets. Pembroke, too, had begun to piece it together. Both were silenced before they could speak. Lady Crane had hatred, yes, but Denby had proximity and, above all, opportunity. He could strike in silence, all while carrying the mask of loyalty." Davis grunted, pacing harder. "And the ledger? His own hand condemns him, but why leave it behind?" "Because pride, Inspector, is a double-edged sword," Miss Marple replied softly. "Denby believed himself untouchable, invisible. He recorded his crimes not as confessions but as victories, and when the weight grew too great, he told himself he did it for her, for Lady Crane. Such delusions often comfort the guilty." A silence fell over the room. Lydia stared at her hands, her voice barely a whisper. "And my grandmother? What of her guilt?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "She bore it because she believed it hers to bear. Denby never corrected her, for it suited his vanity. In truth, she is both guilty and innocent. She did not command his crimes, but she allowed his devotion to become her shield. That silence, too, is a crime of its own." The girl nodded, tears welling. "So justice will be done at last?" The question hung heavy, for justice is never simple. Denby's trial moved swiftly, the evidence overwhelming. The dried flowers, the ledger, the testimony of Lydia and Miss Marple, all painted him as the architect of 2 murders and a conspiracy spanning decades. Yet, when called to speak, he did not deny it. He stood tall, his weathered hands clasped, and declared in a voice that carried across the court, "I did it for her, for Lady Crane. Without me, she would have been destroyed. I alone kept this house whole." His words unsettled the jury more than they expected, for devotion so twisted seemed almost pitiable, yet pity could not wash away the poison in his hands. The verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts, justice then was served. And yet, when Miss Marple returned once more to the conservatory, she found no satisfaction in the orchids. Denby's absence left the glass house strangely lifeless, the blooms hanging limp as though their keeper's shadow still lingered. Lady Crane, now bedridden, faded swiftly into decline, her once commanding presence reduced to whispers and sighs. And Lydia, though freed from suspicion, carried within her the scar of betrayal. Betrayal not only by Denby, but by the grandmother who had chosen silence over truth. One evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting by the fire, Lydia approached her. With a troubled face, "Do you think it is truly over?" she asked. Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes bright but weary. For the courts, yes, for the newspapers, certainly. But for you, my dear, for Lady Crane, for the house itself? No. These things linger. They always do. And indeed they lingered. Denby awaited his sentence without complaint, yet the night before his execution he vanished from his cell. The guards found the door unlocked, the window open to the night. A trail of snowdrops led from the courtyard into the fog, and beyond that, nothing. No footprints, no body, no sign of struggle. The newspapers roared once more, crying scandal, incompetence, conspiracy. But Miss Marple, reading the account in the village paper weeks later, only pursed her lips. Justice served or escaped? The inspector had muttered bitterly when he called upon her for counsel. Neither, Inspector, Miss Marple replied gently. Justice is not a thing that can be locked away in a cell. It is something we strive toward, knowing full well it may slip from our grasp. Denby may walk in the fog, but he cannot escape himself. That in the end is the only prison that matters. And with that, she set her knitting aside, gazing out the window at the snowdrops blooming along the lane. They were beautiful, innocent in their whiteness, and yet forever stained in her mind with the memory of blood. The case was closed, the pattern revealed. But in the hush of the night, one could almost hear the gardener's voice still echoing. Among the orchids, I did it for her. The fog hung heavy that morning, the kind that swallows sound and smothers the sun. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the lane, her shawl wrapped tight about her shoulders, and watched the gardeners of St. Mary Mead at their work. Spring had arrived early, snowdrops clustering beneath hedgerows and along stone walls, delicate and defiant. It was curious, she thought, how flowers endured where men faltered. Denby had vanished weeks ago, his escape whispered about in courtrooms, taverns, and drawing rooms alike. Some swore he had drowned in the marshland, his body carried away by the tide. Others believed he had been spirited abroad, sheltered by some shadowy benefactor. Yet in the village the story was far simpler. Denby had simply melted into the fog, becoming part of it, and would never be seen again. And yet, Miss Marple was not certain. She recalled the final moments of the trial, his voice calm as stone. I did it for her. For Lady Crane. I alone kept this house whole. There had been no fear in his eyes, no desperation, only conviction. A man like that did not flee blindly into the night. She turned away from the flowers and began the slow walk back to her cottage, her steps steady despite the weight in her thoughts. Life in St. Mary Mead had resumed its rhythm, the postmistress gossiping over stamps, Colonel Melchett waving his walking stick in greeting, children darting about with marbles in their pockets. The Crane estate, so recently the stage of tragedy, had fallen silent. Lady Crane had passed quietly in her sleep, and Lydia, now the sole heir, prepared to leave for London, speaking of travel and art, and a new life untethered from glass houses and ghosts. But Miss Marple could not let it rest. There was one detail, one thread unpulled. It nagged at her as she settled into her armchair with her knitting that evening. The ledger, the damning ledger Denby had so foolishly kept, had been meticulous in every respect. Each death, each scheme, each flower pressed into the margins, and yet in the back, written faintly in pencil, was a single line that no one else had thought to mention. The roots go deeper. The inspector had dismissed it as the ramblings of a guilty mind, perhaps even a metaphor for his obsession with gardens. But Miss Marple knew better. Men like Denby did not write riddles idly. If he had meant roots, then he had meant something planted, something that still grew. A knock came at her door. It was Lydia, pale and travel-worn, her trunk already packed. For the morning train. I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, she said softly, her voice carrying both weariness and relief. If not for you, I should still be living in fear. I can't say the shadows are gone, but at least I can face them now. Miss Marple smiled gently and ushered her inside. Over tea, they spoke of London, of the world Lydia meant to build for herself. Yet before she departed, the girl hesitated at the door. There's something odd I found when sorting through my grandmother's things, Lydia said, drawing a folded slip of paper from her coat. It seemed meaningless, but I don't know, it unsettled me. Perhaps you'll make more sense of it. Miss Marple opened the paper and read. It was a list, written in Lady Crane's hand, of names, 4 of them, unfamiliar at first glance. Beside each name was a small mark, a flower sketched in the margin. One bore a snowdrop, another an iris, another a violet, and the last a rose. The old woman felt her pulse quicken. This was no mere fancy. This was a record, perhaps a ledger of her own. And Denby's words echoed in her mind. The roots go deeper, she folded the paper carefully and pressed it back into Lydia's hands. My dear, think nothing of this now. Go to London, begin your life. Leave the past to those of us who are old enough to carry it. Lydia looked uncertain but obeyed. She left with a hug and a whispered promise to write. When the door closed, Miss Marple remained very still. She stared into the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. For all the neatness of the Crane affair, for all the confessions and the trial, it was not finished. Denby's devotion, Lady Crane's silence, the flowers, they were but branches of a larger tree. Somewhere in England, perhaps even closer than anyone suspected, more roots wound through the soil, and if Denby lived, he would tend them still. Later, that night as she blew out her lamp and settled into bed, Miss Marple heard a sound outside her window, a soft rustle, as of footsteps on gravel. She rose, peered through the curtains and saw nothing but the pale gleam of snowdrops blooming in her own garden, her lips pressed into a thin line. A mystery may be solved, she thought, but it never truly ends. Not while flowers still grow in the shadows, and as she returned to her bed she wondered, half in dread, half in certainty, when the next case would call her name.